I'm here today to talk to you about my HSC experiences. Well, I also want to take the time to encourage a different sort of mentality. I want to encourage you to think critically as well about your own kind of path in HSC, and I'll go over what I mean by that throughout. But I'm sure you're here today to hear me talk about my own HSC experiences. So first, what authority do I have to talk to you? In terms of my results for mathematics, they're listed on the slide there. And I've also had some additional achievements in, for instance, the ICAS and the AMC. And I've had a lot of teaching experience with teaching seminars at my school. I think one of the important things to note also is that, as you can see, I do not take Olympiad tuition. So in my opinion, my specialty is involved in trying to understand and unpack HSC mathematics. And I think that's an important perspective in terms of mathematics, because it means I'm not assuming that students are particularly amazing at really hard Olympiad math. Instead, I want to talk to you about the ways, the strategies, and the things I used essentially to get a better understanding and achieve the results I did in mathematics and across the rest of the HSC as well. I was also had a few HSC results outside of mathematics, such as, for instance, being first in the course for chemistry, as well as being 19th in English Advanced. And I think by a few measures, that can be considered a relatively strong result within the HSC. But what I want to impart upon you is also to consider not just in terms of academic results, but also in terms of balancing different priorities. So I think we'll get started. Also, I should mention that I will be tutoring at Toplogic for Extension 1 and/or Extension 2 in mathematics next year. Great. So first, about preparing for the HSC. So I have a few tips written down, and I'm going to go over each one a bit. The first one is about preparing in advance. So many students talk about the idea of burnout. This is especially prevalent among students who work incredibly hard in particular subjects, and then they start feeling less motivated towards the end because they've put in so much effort and now they feel really tired. And pre-preparation is one of the keys to avoiding burning out, because by preparing for things in advance, you kind of pace yourself. It's kind of like running a marathon. You have 6 years, starting from year 7, to prepare for the HSC. If you run half the race by, let's say, year 11, then you have a lot less to do in those final 2 years. And that means that you will reduce the chance of you burning out and feeling less motivated. The second kind of links into that, which is about ordering your subjects. And what I mean is that your time is always going to be finite. So you're going to be doing subjects, for instance, such as English, which is compulsory, of course, mathematics, sciences, perhaps some other humanities like history. And certain subjects are easier to remember, so they could be studied relatively earlier. For instance, the skills in mathematics are applicable across many years, and having experience with math is often, and just understanding how to do the questions, it's easier to remember, for instance, than memorizing an essay for English, in which case I would study mathematics before I studied English, and that's a way to order your subjects. The third one is about relaxing. It's about pacing yourself to maintain a positive mindset, and it's also about getting involved in co-curriculars. So what I mean by a positive mindset is this idea, first of all, of avoiding burnout. It's of avoiding feeling really tired, stressed, and instead giving yourself the chance to relax, especially a day before the exam. It also means getting involved in co-curriculars. For instance, in my school, I was a school monitor, which is equivalent of a prefect. I was also a cadet under officer in the Corps. I was part of my school's debating team, leader of a philosophical society. And also, my school is King's, so we have compulsory sports on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. And I was also involved in Duke of Edinburgh. So what I'm trying to say here isn't that I've done a lot of these things. Wow, it's not that. It's about time management. I haven't devoted a tremendous amount of time towards my studies because I think it's very important to be able to get that level of balance. I think it's more important to be able to study smart, not hard. And I kind of want to get into that in my later slides as well. And the last one is about being able to seek help. And I think that's incredibly important because it means having the right teachers, the right classmates, the right tutors to turn to, both for advice about particular life skills, study strategies, but also about understanding the semantics of the HSC. So for instance, HSC might prefer a certain type of working out for a math question. They might want a particular science question to be approached through a particular structure. They might be looking for certain dot points that need to be hit for each particular question. And the only way you get that sort of knowledge, you can't get it from a textbook. You need to get it from experienced teachers, classmates, and also from tutors, of course. So I want to share a little bit about how I kind of prepare for the HSC because it might give a better understanding of where I stand on this issue. I accelerated Math Advanced and Math Extension 1, as I mentioned in this About Me slide. So that meant that I had basically year 11 to prepare for those 2 HSC subjects. In terms of Math Extension 1, I did about 20 past papers for that, which I wouldn't consider it to be an insane amount, but also it was a good chance for me to develop certain skills, such as, for instance, being able to answer questions in a really accurate way and a really efficient way. It's also about having the ability to manage time and about managing reading time as well. So I managed to gain a lot of these skills from accelerating Math Extension 1 and Math Advanced in year 11. And then when I went into year 12, I actually didn't do many past papers. In fact, I would say I did less than 10 Extension 2 past papers. I focused more on targeting specific questions. And this is the first part. I mentioned in the beginning that I can tell you all of this stuff about study strategies. I can tell you about what I did, my experiences, but ultimately the one who is accountable and the one who is in charge of your studying is ultimately yourself. And so you'll need to figure out the right way, the right approach to take towards a HSC subject. And so again, my goal isn't to tell you all this stuff and say that you need to apply these strategies. It's about getting you to think critically and self-reflect about your own study process. As an example, what are the benefits of past papers? Well, for one, they teach you a lot of skills in terms of answering questions. So for instance, how can I manage my time effectively, answer questions accurately? They also give you experiences dealing with the format of HSC exams, such as, for instance, let's say Extension 2, you have 10 multi-choice questions, 6 longer questions, and each question has multiple parts. And having that experience means that you aren't surprised on the day of the exam. But why would I not do as many past papers as I can? Because often they're considered like the crown jewel. The past papers are really glorified, so why would I not do that many of them? I found that as I did the past papers, I thought that actually I wasn't using my time as effectively as I could. In year 11, I had already gotten all these skills about doing math accurately and doing it efficiently. So why would I need to retrain these skills I was already strong at with the easier questions, and then take up all of that time and not allocate it towards unpacking the harder questions? Because the reason why Extension 2 is so different from other mathematics is because of how many hard questions there are within the course. And so I realized that I actually prefer the targeted questions because they could get to the heart of what I found difficult about Extension 2, which was about seeing an unseen question, taking in all the details in the question. So for instance, does a question involve like a certain concept, like for instance, the modulus of a complex number, which you'll learn when you do Extension 2. And then what strategies immediately jumped to mind? I had like a list of strategies of what to do. For instance, I could square both sides, apply conjugates as an example. And I had like a checklist of strategies I could use to tackle this question when I had no idea where to really begin. And that really helped with understanding more difficult questions. So in the end, it's about time management. And about thinking critically about your study strategies rather than blindly believing in particular methods of study and following them. And that's just an example I want to share. If you feel like your exam skills need improvement, past papers are the way to go. If you feel like you've mastered it and are really having difficulty with those tricky questions at the end of the paper, perhaps targeting the harder enrichment or extension content could be the better way to go. Great. So, as I alluded to before, balancing study and school life, how do you do it? First of all, pre-preparation, it appears again. And it's really important because getting a lot of your study done ahead of time. So as an example, I started doing Extension 2 years prior. Then I went to tutoring 1 year prior, and then I went to tutoring again on the year of the exam. So I basically started Extension 2 2 years earlier. And that enabled me to have a really strong foundation towards tackling Extension 2. And it meant that I could spend a lot less time on certain aspects of the curriculum and focus in more on the things I was finding difficult. So for instance, again, those difficult questions and also other subjects I was finding a bit trickier, like for instance, English. And that also meant I had more time on my hands to dedicate towards particular co-curricular involvements. And I know that a lot of you are probably going to be interested in medicine. And that also links into the third point. I kind of missed a second, but I'll go back to it. On the third point, which is about not sacrificing co-curriculars for an ATAR. Because in a medical interview, which I'm sure a lot of you are going for, co-curriculars become incredibly important in terms of differentiating yourself from candidates who are only good at studying. Moreover, they kind of shape you as a person. And what I mean is the more things you engage in, the more experiences you have to draw upon, and the more mature you become as a person. And even though this isn't relevant towards getting the highest possible ATAR, I mean, your goal ultimately isn't to get the highest possible ATAR, I feel. It would be to get into a good university course and to have the academic foundation to get into a good university course. But that shouldn't come at the expense of, for instance, your personal development and your character. And these things are incredibly important because ultimately the more you learn about, like, the more experiences you have to draw upon from different facets of life, the better you will be, not only in the interview, but also just as a person as a whole. Okay, the second point though, is kind of contradictory, which is about avoiding major commitments. If you do want a really strong ATAR, often it's better not to commit to something incredibly major. If that is a part of your identity, if you feel it's incredibly important for you, I would say still go with it. But then the question becomes not how can I get a strong ATAR while maintaining co-curriculars. It's about what would I rather prioritize? Would it be this commitment or would it be my ATAR? So major commitments include, for instance, being a school captain. Sorry, it differs between school to school, but a lot of school captains have many extra duties, especially in my school, for instance. They do a lot of interviews and sometimes they go to different campuses on like particular leadership days. It takes up a lot of time. Rowing as well is a sport which takes up a tremendous amount of time. And also being like the first in a sport like cricket, because each match takes, I believe, about 6 hours of your weekend. So you can still have a diverse range of complex experiences without going to these major commitments, such as, for instance, the ones I listed below. And you can still have that level of kind of personal development to bring towards a particular interview. And then the fourth tip I have is about scheduling, and it's about using pockets of time. And I think this is especially important for people with many different activities. I'll give you a few examples of what I mean. First, scheduling is about planning out everything you have and keeping track of all your assignments, all your deadlines. I'm pretty sure Jenny is going to go into that in a lot more detail than I can, so I'll gloss over that. But I want to focus on this idea of pockets of time, which is about drawing upon little moments of time you have in your day. So as an example, I was involved in the International Chemistry Olympiad, and that took a ton of time. It took 13 days of the summer holidays, the Christmas holidays. And then there was a 1 week training in the term 1 holidays. And then there was, I believe, about 8 days in an external competition. Sorry, 8 days going to Canberra to prepare for that competition, which is in the term 2 holidays. And then also, like, that is a significant commitment of time. And so how I kind of went around that issue was during Duke of Edinburgh, which is doing the hike. At the end of the day, when we had done all the stuff, there was plenty of time left over. So I actually brought notes for the Chemistry Olympiad to my Duke of Edinburgh hike. And it's used that time to rewrite those notes and to get a better understanding of the concepts. I knew I was going to waste that time if I didn't use it productively. And so I was able to really draw upon that pocket of time, so to speak, to really take advantage of it. And it also helped because the drive there was like 6 hours. So I was another 6 hours of time. Pockets of time can also be very small. It could be something as simple as, for instance, if you have an extended recess at school, maybe take the chance in your recess to do some of your homework, so that when you go home, you don't need to do homework anymore. You can focus on writing notes for your assignments. This gives you plenty of time, and it helps you really manage this balance between study and school life. You don't need to spend every waking moment of your day studying. In fact, it would lead to burnout and it would make you feel horrible. It would probably reduce your productivity in the long run. Great. So exam techniques. Exam techniques, I feel, are something that is incredibly personal, which is why the examples I provided are merely examples, not really anything else. And I can't share how they play out for me personally. But once again, the most important thing for exam techniques is having an open mind, not thinking, well, this particular person did really well, has this technique that they always use. That must be the one and only technique. I must use it. More like, this is a good technique, but is it the best technique for me? I will try out multiple different techniques, multiple different approaches to an exam, do some past papers, and then decide which ones work best for me. So I have a few examples. First of all is taking a break the day before. That's something I think is very important. I make sure to barely do anything the day before exam, apart from looking over a few notes. Especially for English, it's important not to tire out my hand the day before, because it reduces my speed on the day. The second one applies to mathematics. And this is finish the test quickly in about 60% of the time and then do the paper again. that's a strategy I use for extension 1. I was able to perform quite well externally because of it. So whereas for advanced, I actually use the third technique, which is finish the test slowly, checking as you go, and then quickly check again. And the way I could decide is I use those 2 different techniques for those 2 different subjects in quite a few exams. And I tried to see which ones had the greatest incidence of error. And I found that using the second technique for mathematics extension 1 and using the third technique for advanced was able to produce the greatest results. So once again, completely up to you. And it's important to be able to save time in order to really develop those exam techniques and personalize them for yourself. Part 4 relates to reading time. And I think that's incredibly important. Many people think it's a good idea to finish the multi-choice in reading time. I think that's a very poor idea personally, but it completely, again, that's my personal opinion. And if you find that it works best for you, that will be an exam technique you take on board. I prefer to plan out my plan of attack in reading time. In extension 1, you have 10 minutes reading time, I believe. And when I was going into the exam, I tried to make sure I had an idea of how to answer every single question after the reading time had passed. Your plan might not be so ambitious. Your plan might be to figure out how to answer the last group of questions in reading time, or it could be to answer the first half of the test in reading time. Or it might not even be any of those. It just completely depends on you. Great. So now I want to get into the idea of mathematics. Why choose mathematics for your HSC? And I think this links back into the idea of pre-preparation, which is that mathematics is a really easy subject to prepare for early. Whereas for English, you have to memorize a bunch of essays. For economics, you need to stay constantly up to date with the trends in the news and statistics in the news. And for history, again, you need to memorize a ton of essays, even more than English, in fact. Whereas mathematics is something you can literally build from primary school and then in the early bits of high school. You can develop that skill set that's necessary, do it in advance, like for instance I did, and then when you get into the HSC, you already have these solid foundations, and you just need to work upon it by understanding the semantics of HSC marking, the particular kind of nuances needed to produce a really strong response, which is why I think mathematics is such a great choice. But of course, choosing a subject is something, again, very personal, and it's about critically thinking about each subject, whether your strengths play into that subject or not. So I'll go over the syllabus of Math Extension 1 and Math Extension 2 very quickly. This is all available generally on the website for NESA, but then I'll give a brief outline of what each point means. And I think the big takeaway though is that all of this stuff is really available online. So being proactive and getting an understanding of each course before doing things like tutoring or your own research can really help. And it's about being really kind of proactive in your study. So kind of to recap today, I've kind of gone over, first of all, my tips for preparing for the HSC in terms of, for instance, preparing beforehand, and a lot of the other tips such as taking a break and ordering subjects. We've also talked a little bit about exam techniques and about the importance of balancing co-curriculars with academics. But I think the main thing that I wanted to focus on, and going back to the beginning, is about this idea of critical thinking. It's about looking a little bit deeper beyond just doing studying and doing the work, but about having a strong understanding of exactly how your study techniques and how your particular approaches to questions can be improved upon through strategies, having a really strong self-awareness. So as I wrap up today, within my allotted time, I just wanted to end on one particular one particular note. I focus a lot on critical thinking in terms of understanding your own approach to study, in terms of understanding your study techniques and your study strategies. But one last thing that I think is very important for you to critically think about is your motivation for studying. Do you want to potentially support people in the future? Do you want to challenge yourself with research? These are all different possibilities. And by having a strong understanding of the reasons behind your actions and your motivations, your key motivations to do well in the HSC, that will be almost like the guiding light that protects you from things such as burnout. And it gives you a sense of direction, even when you're lost in the darkness of the HSC. So thank you for having me.
Welcome to tonight's webinar. Kevin's already spoken a lot about preparing for HSC, so I'll try and talk about the different aspects to it, some things that he didn't really touch upon. So before we begin, a little bit about me as well. I graduated from James Bruce Agricultural High School just this year. I got an ATAR of 99.95 and I also state ranked 10th for physics. And in terms of maths, I got an HSC mark of 98 in 3 unit and 96 in 4 unit. Right, so moving on to our agendas for today, I'm going to talk about 3 main areas. So how to prepare for HSC, time management when it comes to studying, preparing for school exams and HSC exams as well. And lastly, studying HSC Maths and the different sort of things that you should keep in mind when you're approaching the subject, and how to build that interest in mathematics, which in the end will push you to do your best and motivate you in your studies. Right, so starting off with how to prepare for the HSC. So this is just a rough timeline that I keep in mind, especially just subconsciously when I approach any exam. So this is like really simple, and I've broken it down to 2 main parts when you're still in the learning stage, and then 2 of the biggest parts that comprise your HSC mark in the end, which will obviously go then into factor into your ATAR. So starting off with what I would consider the first step to studying and learning, which is learning. So we all need to start off somewhere, especially when we jump from year 10 into year 11. So I've been told that there are a lot of junior kids here and also parents. So there's a really big jump from, say, junior school to senior school, in that you might be taking up a completely new topic or subject. For example, chemistry and physics, you've always learnt them as sciences before, but what you're going to be exposed to in senior school is completely different, in my opinion anyways, completely different from what you've been exposed to in junior school. So it's really hard to take that first step and to find your footing in a subject that you're not really familiar with. So whether that's the jump, as I mentioned before, into senior school, or just starting off a new module or starting off a new topic, learning, coming across new concepts, it's always really important that you take the time to understand and digest the content. So after you've sat through a 2-hour cheering lesson or double period of, say, maths, chemistry, whatever, make sure that you read over your notes after class. So an example of this would be how I read through my tutoring notes after my tutoring lesson for chemistry and physics. So I get home about, it ends at 9 p.m, I get home about 9:30. And then that night, literally at 11 p.m, I would sit down and I would just read and skim it over, because hearing it once in class is fine, but you really need to revise that and to read it over to make sure that you've understood it, even if it is the first attempt. So reading over your class notes is something that I did the day after class, maybe another time during the middle of the week, and then right before the next lesson as well, in regards to my tutoring lessons. And another point that I've written down there is thinking about your content throughout the week. So this is something that I found incredibly helpful. So if I'm just sitting in the car and driving to school, there's literally no thoughts in my brain. What I would do is to just be like, hey, what did I learn in chemistry this week? And I would just sit in the car seat and try and sort of make a mind map of the different things and just write out like the subtitles of the lesson that we talked about in class. And I found that incredibly useful because the syllabus is organized into different categories, and just having that sort of active recall that's going in your memory and having that sort of mind map, that really helped me. And it made the memorization, all of that, a lot easier later on the line, just because you've been thinking about it so many different times, whether you're in the car, on the train, or just sitting around doing absolutely nothing. So you can make productive time with that. The second point that I've got there is asking questions. So during your lesson times, always make sure that you clarify anything with the teacher. And I know this is a really common piece of advice, but I absolutely cannot stress how important this is. And even if you think you know something, but you're just like, even if it's 1%, you're 1% unsure, just make sure that you ask the teacher just to clarify, just to confirm. And this is something that I did actively. So even when I didn't have a question to ask, I would try and think of a creative question to ask my teacher, or think of something that's maybe, it could be a little bit of an extension, but I would still make sure to ask my teacher, because at the end of the day, that was what really kept me engaged during the lessons. And having that sort of conversation with your teacher, your tutor, that makes sure that you're still digesting the content, and it also makes sure that you're still following along. So even if I sort of understood what was going on, sometimes I would still ask my tutor when there was sort of a break in the class. I'd go like, hey, can I relay some of the information that I've understood back to you, just to make sure that it's correct? So even if you're explaining it back to them and it's not really a question, I still think it's helpful, and it's really important to keep that sort of two-way communication with your school teachers or your tutors. And the last thing that I have written there is making notes. So not a lot for me to say under this dot point, but one important thing is to keep them simple. So when I first got into year 11, I made the mistake of trying to make my notes as detailed as possible. So that was a mistake on my behalf. Number one, because I didn't have time to complete them in the end, so they were completely useless. Number two, when you clutter the key concepts with so many other details and unnecessary information, you lose sight of what's actually important. And because I added so many little extension tips and extension details, in the end, the school exam, they didn't really test any of that. So it was a complete waste of time at the end. And just keep that in mind when you're making notes, keep them simple. And this is something that you'll study off later. So try not to use your friend's notes either, because the note-breaking process is what helps you learn. And while I was writing my notes, it was also a way for me to learn the content myself, to explain it to myself, and it was sort of like writing a textbook in the way in how I tried to organize the information in a logical sequence that made sense to me. And that was really how I learned from making my own notes as well. Okay, so you've learned all the school content. What do you do next? You need to revise. You need to revise from the moment that you think you understand the information right until the exam. So you really need to keep all this content fresh in your mind. So what do? Firstly, you start off with practice questions, and doing those practice questions makes sure that you understand the content. When it comes closer to the exam, you'll start off with past papers as well. So Kevin mentioned this in his presentation earlier. So not doing an insane amount of past papers, because a lot of it won't really be helpful by the end. From personal experience, I can stand by that statement. And I would strongly encourage everyone to only do the relevant past papers. So for example, if I'm studying for a school exam in chemistry, I know what Bruce teachers are looking for in a chemistry response. So I probably won't go and do a past paper from another school, just for example, like Sydney Girls, because I know the marking criteria is so different. And how heavily they want to focus on, for example, again, working scientifically or just theory and regurgitation, that all differs between different schools. So it's really important to only do the relevant past papers that you think will be helpful. Another thing to keep in mind is that I also had heard of all these insane rumors of James Bruce kids doing a lot of past papers, but I've also heard about people who do the same past paper twice, and people were also like bragging about it, and I was a little bit confused about that at first, because if you've done a past paper and you've done it properly, why would you need to do it twice? So the important part about past papers as well is after you finish the paper, that's only 50% of the way. You also need to spend your time revising and looking over the different parts of the past paper and your weaknesses and what the past paper has told you about your own skills and your own abilities. So if you're doing the past papers right, you shouldn't have to do them a second time. If you're doing the same math question twice and you don't realize that it's the same math question, there's probably something going wrong there as well. And I put practice questions after past papers there on my slide, and the reason why that is because from your past papers you can see where your weaknesses are, and from that sort of diagnostic test you can then focus on practice questions that are targeted to that one area. For example, if I'm struggling with proofs in 4-unit maths and I see that in every single question in the past paper I've gotten a proof question wrong, I would focus on proof questions in my practice questions later on the line. And the last point I have there is to quiz your friends. So I know there's a little bit of a stigma surrounding working with your friends when it's still internals. I'm not sure if this is the same for every school, but I've definitely know that there's sort of like that air of competition, especially when you're trying to beat them internally. But remember that studying with your friends, you're not just helping them, they're also helping you. So when you quiz your friends, it's a really quick and easy way to memorize content-heavy topics. So for example, before a chemistry exam, I would pop quiz my friend, list the different advantages of biofuels, and then she'd list them. I would be able to fill in any points that she's missed, and it's much quicker than writing as well. So it's a really quick and easy way to memorize this content-heavy subjects. And then the last two steps, school exams and HSC exams. So school exams, you'll have them throughout the year, pretty self-explanatory, but a really important point to keep in mind is that every single one of them matters. And you shouldn't fall into the habit of saying it's only worth 20%, because that 20% is going to blemish your overall mark. And I've had friends who have done exceptionally well in, say, every single assessment task, just except for that one assessment task at the really beginning where they really haven't found their footing in year 12 yet. And that had such a big impact on their final ranking. And I can see that. And it's just a shame to have missed out just from that one assessment task. So take them all of equal importance and study hard for each and every single one of them. And then for your HSC exams as well, carry that mindset over. It's the last step. You don't have study for another 3 months after this. So make sure that you put in the same effort, if not more, for your HSC exams, because it is worth 50% of your final mark, right? So all those little school exams that you've done before, this is worth like so much more than all of that combined. So you really want to take this opportunity to boost your ranks as much as possible. So I rambled on a little bit there, so I'll go a little bit quicker, but time management is what I have next on my slides. And this is just a rough guideline for what you should be doing throughout the school term. So make sure that you make your notes ahead of school pace. For example, as you learn in tutoring, most tutoring centers go 1 term ahead of school pace, so that fits in quite well with how you should be pacing your own study. And this is especially important because you don't want to be making notes the week before your exams. You want to have them ready 1 term ahead so that when the school exam comes along, you can just revise off those notes. You're not still learning new content. And another thing that you can do, because you've made all these notes in advance, when you're just attending school lessons, you can just annotate in the margins, and this is a lot easier than trying to copy down everything on the board. And I found this extremely helpful in my own studies. For exam prep, make sure that you review your notes in a way that requires active recall. So instead of just trying to read them, try and think of different creative ways that you can review your notes. So for example, teaching your friends from your notes. So I during a lesson, I would literally just turn to my friend who was sitting next to me and be like, hey, do you want me to teach you about the motor force? And then I would just give them a lesson and point to my notes and be like, okay, this is the formula, this is how you apply it, blah, 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 this is what's going on. And this is a good way to review your notes and still keep it interesting and fun. And it also makes sure that you're using active recall. So keeping it fresh in your brain and not just passively taking in information. And this last point, it differs from person to person, but personally, I started doing past papers at least 2 to 3 weeks before my exams. So I know that some people might like to start earlier, some people start later. It's all up to you, but this was what I found best works for me. And a lot of people do like to do past papers throughout the term as well. And that's absolutely fine if you're comfortable with the content then. In general, when you're studying, make sure that you remove your distractions. So switch your phone off, go put it in the next room or something, but it's really hard to recognize just how much time you're wasting by unlocking your phone, spending 2 minutes on Instagram and then locking it again and then putting it away. When you think of all that time put together, it actually accumulates to maybe say 2-3 hours of your day that's wasted because you're not really taking a break, but you're not really studying either. So you're just wasting time. So make sure that you remove those distractions. As I said before, I would just turn my phone off and I would personally just put it in the cupboard, and I was too lazy to get it out while I was studying. So that worked for me. Whatever works for you, works for you. And also spread out moments for study throughout your day. So I know Kevin talked about this a little bit before as well. So you can always, when you're in public transport on the train, maybe just whip out a textbook and start reading it, or like start reading over your notes. Or as I mentioned before, when you're in the car, start thinking about your physics lesson, your maths lesson, your English lesson. And spreading out these different moments throughout the day, make sure that you're not really wasting any time and you're always doing something productive. And lastly, everyone manages their time differently. So it's okay to sort of keep it on a more lax, free flow sort of method rather than timetabling. So on this next slide here, this is an example, a snippet, a screenshot of my friend's study timetable leading up to the HSC. So as you can see on the top row, you have all the different subjects, and on the first column, first 2 columns, you have the different dates. So what she's done here is plan out the different things that she's going to do in each day. And this is a good way, this timetabling method is a good way to make sure that you're spending adequate time on each of your subjects. Personally, I never really found this effective. I tried to do it, it never really stuck to me because I was more of I did this much in this day, okay, I'm done. And then tomorrow I'm feeling more motivated, I'll do more work. I didn't really like to stick to a schedule, but if this works for you, it works for you. That's absolutely fine, and it's each to their own. And finally, moving on to studying for HSC Maths. So I'd also like to take this time to mention that I'll also be working as a tutor at Toplogic next year for Maths, for both either or 3-unit and 4-unit. So I'd love to see some, if any of you guys in my classes next year as well. And what I find really important about studying is having that self-motivation to do the best that you can in any subject. And this really comes from building an interest in subject that you're working towards. So for maths, what I found the most interesting was to sort of like visualize or physicalize the question. For example, as I've written here, I've always found it interesting to visualize like different 2D or 3D curves on Desmos and GeoGebra. This is just a little bit of interest of mine. I don't know if anyone else would find it interesting, but I've always been a bit of a nerd. So yeah, on this slide, that's just like a helix. You'll learn it in 4-unit maths. It's actually not that difficult when you come across it, but I don't know. I found that this was something that interested me, and I love plotting these different curves. And if that's what makes you interested in the subject, go for it, go do it. Plot all those different curves out on Desmos, because in the end, you'll be benefiting from it. And that was the second point. The first point is to do interesting and niche questions. So it's quite rewarding when you're able to apply your skill set to solve different problems, especially when they're the more challenging questions. And I always found it more interesting to do the questions that aren't like the typical textbook questions that sort of repeat the same skill over and over. So make sure that you do have variety in the questions that you're attempting as well, so that it doesn't become too boring. If you think you've mastered a type of question, just move on. It's okay. The third point I have there is to learn with your friends. So I've mentioned this before as well, working with your friends to achieve the best you can. I always found it fun to like race my friends in solving integrals. That's just something that I found fun personally. You can find different little ways to study with your friends. For example, do past papers together. That would also help you build an interest in maths. And the last point I have there is to be wary of the questions that you're choosing to do. So don't just stick to the hard out of syllabus questions, because when you're doing question after question that you just cannot solve, it can get very frustrating. I've been there, I've done that before, and most of the time these questions are irrelevant. So you're spending time doing extension questions that probably won't pop up in an exam, and that's just a big waste of time, not to mention demoralizing. So what you should take away from that point is to learn extension that is relevant and helpful instead. This wasn't to say that I don't encourage extension content. I'm all for learning extension, but just make sure that it's not too over the top to a point that it's frustrating and demoralizing. And also make sure that you're tying it in syllabus content, so it's really helping you do the best in the subject. And the last point I'm going to talk about is exam tips. So Kevin mentioned this before about multiple choice, but I think I have a stronger opinion than him on it. So do not do multiple choice during reading time. Spend that time reading through the exam paper. And the reason why I encourage this is because when you're actually in the exam, you're going to be stressed out. And I'm not usually someone who gets stressed out easily, but especially when you're under time pressure, it's easy to skip over words in the question, which is why reading time is there. It's there for you to read through the paper and take a mental note of all those different words that are like hidden within the question. Especially for maths, if you can't do a question, skip it, right? So you don't want to spend 20 minutes and still getting no result from a question and still not having progressed from the first line of working, right? So if you can't do something, skip it and come back to it later. As Kevin mentioned before, you want to spend a fraction of your exam time going through the paper and then coming back to it later again. He said a 60%, 40% split. That differs from person to person. And yeah, but it's absolutely okay to skip a question in an exam. And also another thing to keep in mind is to approach each new question as if you were starting a new exam. So you've just skipped a question and you don't really feel too certain about your own abilities anymore. Forget that. Take a deep breath, drink like a sip of water, and then start the next math question as if you were heading into a new exam. And don't bring that frustration and that confusion onto the next question, because that could become quite detrimental to your overall exam performance. And the last point, this is quite a common point, so just underlining the key points in the question makes sure that to make sure that you're covering every single part and you haven't skipped over any sort of wording that's really essential to the question. And that's all I have for you today. So thank you all for listening.